But so again, welcome everybody. I didn't tell you guys I actually made a name for this.
Okay.
Was it? I think I called it "Been Pastoring Through Some Hard Times."
Ooh.
Been pastoring through some hard times.
That's good.
Yeah.
Been pastoring through some hard times.
Because the book.
Yeah,
been
coming through some
because
hard
we're
times.
talking about pastoring.
Come on. Through some hard times.
right.
Yeah. So
makes sense.
so that's the idea. Hopefully I don't get slapped with a copyright infringement. I feel like that.
You threw the word off, so
Yeah,
it doesn't count anymore.
But if you don't have the book, you definitely should get the book. Not because we make any royalties off of it. We don't make any money off. We don't even necessarily have permission to do this.
yeah, wait.
But I don't think we need permission to do this because we're just talking about a book.
Right.
But we are in chapter 2 now. If you have not been watching or following along, please go back and watch. And honestly, read along. If you can get a copy of the book and read it for yourself, that would be ideal.
Slavery, the terror of
yeah.
imagination, and exiled freedom.
Yes,
in
that is the title of this chapter. This is going to be a two-parter, but this one we were talking about. We're going to focus in on an important woman in the history of this community and her journal. So, Brandon.
Yeah, so this Ellen Wallace character is an interesting person. Miss Ellen, Ellen McGahee Wallace, and her journal is referenced not just in this book, but if you go down to the museum here in Hopkinsville,
Right. You can see pages of it.
you can actually see pages of the journal, facsimiles and stuff, and so.
Yeah.
So it's a valuable historical document, right? In that it gives us the perspective of one person on the issue that's being addressed, because so much of her journal really ends up dealing with the Civil War and slavery, the relationship of white people and black people. And so I think it's really fascinating, but there was one right off the beginning here, and you guys can talk more about the intro to the chapter there if you want to, but the one that stood out to me was where she's recording this moment where, it was customary for slave owners to send their slaves out to work at other places. They would receive remuneration for sending their slave to work for somebody else. And she talked about this slave, Lewis, who was sent out to work at an ironworks, died as a result. And you get this journal entry where she's saying, hey, we got news today that Lewis died. And what she said just really struck me. She said, we have the pleasing hope that he rests in peace with God, and that sounds like a great sentiment, except she follows it up with, oh, masters and mistresses, what a fearful responsibility rests upon you, how much we need the strength and guidance of the Almighty God. She goes on to say, Lewis didn't want to go.
Yeah.
Right.
We literally had to force him to go, but what a great example his death is, and a reminder of how hard it is to own slaves.
Yeah. In addition to that, it said he met his faith like a hero and a Christian.
What a good black man he was.
Wow. Yeah. And I think when you understand that mindset of the white man's burden, and you look at that and you can say, wait a second, how in the world does this accord with the gospel of grace? And how does this accord with the gospel of peace? And how does this accord with a gospel that gives dignity to every image bearer?
Yeah.
And it's really difficult to read that and not come away saying, wow.
Yeah.
We might have missed something.
We are...
You think?
We might have missed something.
In this chapter, we're going to go and we're going to talk in great detail about Miss Ellen. And I don't know why I want to call her Miss Ellen.
Ever since we first picked up this book months ago, you're like, Miss Ellen. It's like,
well, she was a real person.
Yeah.
Yes.
And as you read her diaries, her diary, we are reading her thoughts.
Yeah.
We are reading her feelings, her way of seeing the world, her worldview. And so to me, and we'll get into a lot of examples of what all this means and how she felt and what she saw and whatnot, but there's got to be some cognitive dissonance between her Christian faith and how she saw slaves.
I disagree.
Okay. Well, hold on.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, because in my mind, and that's fine.
Yeah.
In my mind, it's like, okay, in her Christian faith, she knew these were humans, but they were less than human. To send someone out and have almost little disregard for who Lewis left behind. Was Lewis a dad? Was Lewis married? What are his children thinking? Things like that. That, with the compassion that it seems that she showed on the surface, there's also a level of emotional disconnect that generally you would have for a grieving friend that is obviously absent. Even though she knew a great deal about Lewis, there was this wall that existed that she did not go, she did not cross, and her mind did not allow her, nor her emotions allow her to go to there. And so it's obvious that she has a lot of Christian thoughts. She probably read the Bible. She's praying a lot. We see that she gives praise to God, all of these kind of things. So in addition to looking at her life, we're going to look at this also through the perspective that this was presumably a Christian woman in Christian County. And we're just going to assume here, I mean, I don't think we have a lot of evidence that she probably attended church, and which meant she also had a pastor in Christian County. And as pastors in Christian County, if this was one of our congregants, how do you disciple somebody through all this?
Yeah. And that's why I disagree, because I say that she was most likely, based off what we have in history and her own recordings, a very good Christian. She was this, and that's what she's saying, and even in her journal entry, like, this is important for us to be good Christians as slave owners. Like, there was a huge train of thought that said that to be a good white Christian person is to be a slave owner,
a good slave owner,
not just a good slave, but also a slave. Like, there's this level that says that owning slaves. I mean, who was it? The Whitfield,
right?
Who, this is how we're going to fund our orphan projects, and this is how we're going to fund the mission work we're going to be doing, because we are going to have slaves, but in having slaves, we're going to Christianize these savages. We're going to give them the gospel. No, we're not going to go in Africa and actually preach the gospel. That's too much. We're going to trap them, kidnap them, enslave them, and then we can give them the gospel. So like, that was their theology. So for her, it wasn't a disconnect between Christianity. The Christianity she knew, that she was taught, that she was brought up in, and the foundations of the Christian faith was, as a white woman, owning slaves is because you are being a good Christian.
So let me ask you, I want to ask you guys this question. So can you Sunday morning history back, like Sunday morning quarterback, can you Sunday or Monday morning history this question? Can you be a good Christian, and this is really significant for you guys for some reason. Can you be a good Christian, a good follower of Jesus Christ, and a good slave owner?
I have black family members and friends who may be mad at me for saying this, but I'm going to say yes, only because, not in the sense that
chattel slavery.
Exactly, and I'm saying yes in the sense that, because I also believe that you can be, and this, I have my thoughts sometimes, my words, but I'm just going to say them all. I believe that you can be a good Christian and a prostitute. Okay. You can be a good Christian and incarcerated. You can be a good Christian and honestly,
and a good sinner,
and honestly, a corporate lawyer. Like, because if I start saying that this one sin means that you can no longer be categorized as a good Christian, then I'm limiting Christianity so much so that nobody is ever a good Christian. So in that sense, I would say that if you can't be a good Christian and a good slave owner, then no one can be a good Christian.
So let's label that. What is the sin in slave owning?
There's a myriad of sins. It's a constellation of sins. Okay,
galaxies of sins.
Yes, spiraling around one another. Because you have the idea of idolatry. You have the idea of of murder and rape and coveting. You have this idea of essentially taking God's name in vain. You have this idea of not honoring the idea of the workflow as God defines it. There are so many levels and layers of sin.
Not loving your neighbor.
That's what I was going to say. We go to Jesus, and Jesus kind of nails this down when he says, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you."
Well, I was going to break it down Levitically. I'm like we can break this down. Like, there's a lot of
we can go to Leviticus,
there's a lot of laws.
We can go to Jesus too. We can go to Jesus, and it's very clear. And I don't think Wallace or any of her contemporaries would say, "This is how I want to be treated. I want to be sent to the forge so I can die doing a job I don't want to do to enrich people that own me."
Yeah.
And so, just from Jesus' standpoint, no. But to your point, Kamarr, how many of those things are there today that we put up with because of living in the culture that we do, because of embracing the benefits of modernity?
Yeah.
Right? Everybody who wears cheap clothing is benefiting from the exploitation of a population somewhere.
Well,
Right.
literally, what we're doing
Bangladesh
right
or
now,
somewhere else.
this was made with slavery.
Ah,
But it's the truth. Child slavery around the world is what gets us the precious minerals that allows us to have this technology we enjoy. We are using the products of slavery today, right now in this moment, to even produce what we're producing. That's the reality of it. And
you buy this stuff.
because the thing is that there is no way to extricate yourself from it. You have to, but that does not mean that you shouldn't be mindful of it either. That is the real issue. Is not sitting there saying, okay, you know what, I can't buy anything. Everything has to be conflict free. There is no conflict free anything on this planet. Everything is too connected. There isn't. You can't, because the only way to possibly maybe pull that off would be for me to deny my responsibility in the Great Commission to go and make disciples.
Right.
I can't do that and completely extricate myself from this sinful world we live in.
Do you think that's what Miss Ellen was thinking?
I don't know. She didn't write about that.
Because this was her world. Everything was woven in. Slavery was such a part of life. It was their economy. It was their world. It was their reality. So maybe extricating slavery from her faith was undoable.
I don't know that she did, but the reason why I don't think she believed like that is because she was adamant about not upending the system. She was very much so opposed to the idea of ending slavery. She was not a Confederate sympathizer in the sense of saying we should succeed from the Union, but when she talks about Lincoln and how she wishes he was dead.
Oh gosh, she really did not like.
Let me see here. Here we go. September 29th. This is on page 57. September 29th, 1862. This is her entry. Lincoln's proclamation emancipating all the slaves is justly creating great indignation. The consequences of it are too awful to contemplate. The blood of women and children and helpless aged will flow in torrents if it's carried into effect. The foul wretch, speaking of Lincoln, ought to suffer all the torments that could be inflicted on him, body and soul. Then to place innocent women and helpless infants at the mercy of black monsters who would walk in human shape. So no, I don't think she
didn't like him very much, did she?
She was not a big fan.
She called us monsters, Richard.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Boogity boogity.
She didn't like Lincoln, and she didn't like you.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Let's think that out for a second. Okay, so ponder with me, if you will. You are a black monster in the eyes of Christian County, every woman. That's
Yeah. How do you walk down the street? How do you work? How do you live your life knowing?
how do you become human if you were considered, look at this, a black monster who would walk in human shape?
Yeah.
And, one generation removed from this thought, does that fix anything? 2 generations, 3? I mean, how many are we now? I mean, I know it's 150 years later, but has the residue of the black monster thought still permeated our culture today?
Well, again, like we talked about last time, right? My great-great-grandmother was born enslaved. I know that one for sure. My great-grandmother then would have been raised in a society that was still largely run and dominated by former slave owners with those sentiments still embedded in their mind frame.
So let me ask you this. So the things that stereotypes, we know they exist in all shapes, forms, sizes, and every culture under the sun. This is not unique. But I'm wondering, when an African American walks across the parking lot at a grocery store and there's let's just say a Caucasian woman who sees this guy, let's say he's got baggy pants, a hoodie, wife beater on, he's kind of maybe a do-rag, some cornrows, things like that. Does she lock her doors? And if she does lock her doors, is there a stereotypical mindset that has predated her, that's been passed down, maybe even through news media, maybe through, stories that parents told of the black monster who walks in human shape?
Well, I would say sometimes the people in this situation will say, in my defense, even if you were white, I would have done that. And I say, you may be right. If you had a white guy with cornrows and do-rag, and I was like, you might have. But the added thing that's not often talked about, or at least I don't feel like it's talked about enough, is that may be true. But do you understand the added psychological weight that black guy carries? That he already carries this weight of thinking they might still view me as a monster. And when you do that, you now affirmed his suspicions, even if you don't really, even if your thing is, no, I think of everybody who looks like that, not skin color, but just dress. But he has this extra weight that the white guy might not carry. And now he might feel like, you know what, since you call me a monster, I'll show you what kind of monster I am.
And on the other side, there is historical evidence that the thought in our community was that the black monster would walk around in human shape.
Yeah.
So it's not outside the ballpark to think that even a minuscule remnant of that might still exist.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, so, I mean, you brought Miss Ellen, as you call her.
Miss Ellen.
Funny thing about her, the house that she built. So I live in the historic district here in off of Main Street, and the house she built is not too far from my house. It's on Main Street.
How far away would you say it is if as a crow flies?
It's like a 3-minute walk.
Wow.
Like,
do you think Miss Ellen never would have imagined the day when you live 3 minutes away?
well, the funny thing, the historical homes they have names. So that's the Wallace home, which is right there. And if you look it up online, you can see the Wallace home, big white building right near our hospital now. But down the street, the home I live in is the Starling home. And the Starling home pretty much was the second largest slave owner. The Wallaces and the Starlings intermarried. The last Starlings, more or less, who owned our house that we live in, they actually were last name Wallace because the two families intermarried.
Okay.
So I have that connection with the Wallaces as well. I've met some of her descendants. They're nice young men. They are happy that I live there. They love that a family lives in the house now. They've told me stories. Like the Wallaces today who know of me love that I live there and embrace that is my home.
So Miss Ellen's great-grands, whatever that might be, third, fourth generation, they're happy that you live in that house today. So just so we're all clear, you live in a historical home, a large historical home that's on the way to downtown that was once owned by a large slave-owning family.
It was built by them, specifically for them.
So it was built by slaves.
Well, no. So it was built shortly after the end of the Civil War. Okay. But I mean, the people who built it were enslaved when they were born, most likely.
So it was built by people that had enslaved hands.
Yes. They were wealthy from slavery, and they built that home. And the descendants of that family and the Wallace family, pretty much the two bigger slave-owning families in Christian County, they eventually intermarried. And their descendants today, who know that we live in that home, own that home, are actually happy that we live there. So to say, for people like it's all negative, that's a positive. That's something that should be, you would think, to be honest, let's be real, that should be talked about in the community. They should say, hey, Wallaces, why don't you get together with the Richeés and let's talk about the history of your family and the history of these homes and how you're happy to see black people living in these homes right now.
Now, that is a little bit of redemption to some degree. I mean, obviously, you weren't from this community, so it's not the same as if your family was
as if
here.
a Killebrew.
Yeah. Like we mentioned in the last episode about a Killebrew who's black, and there's also white Killebrews. If a Killebrew had owned that, who their ancestors once had been slaves, that would have been a little bit more redemptive. But the fact that society has changed to the degree that this is even possible. There's no more redlining that would have prohibited. There's no systemic banking laws that have prohibited you from living there, things like that. And there was no societal outcry that prohibited you from living there. So there's definitely some societal differences from Miss Ellen's day and the day that we live in now.
Yeah. That's a change.
And praise the Lord for it.
Yeah. Amen.
Praise
Hallelujah.
the Lord for it.
That's also why it is I hang out on my front porch so much too. I will tell you, so completely irrelevant, interesting story I learned from somebody was telling me a story about the Wallaces, and the last Mr. Starling who lived there, because they still called him Mr. Starling. And apparently he would mow his front yard on his riding mower, drinking a martini.
Wow.
And I was like, man, this house does just have people with style. Like dads with style live here. Like he's like that's awesome.
That's like the rich people on Gilligan's Island.
Like
right.
Pinkies up.
Yeah. Like I make
you
this
should do that. Yeah.
I mean,
with the olive and everything.
Yeah, get some Gatorade and olive and
that is,
pinkies.
That is an awesome story. I love that. But back to Miss Wallace. Back to
Miss Ellen.
Miss Ellen.
You can't do it. You can't do it.
I feel a little bit too.
It's too respecting.
I feel too field Negro saying Miss Ellen.
I think that's why I say it though, because it makes me feel like if people. I can't verify this, but I think people back in the day they referred to her as Miss Ellen.
I know, and that's why I said for me it just feels a little too like. field Negro. Like, no, forget that, Michelle.
Yeah.
Wallace.
Do we need to explain the difference between there were two types of slaves? Biblically, there's, slaves of righteousness and slaves of sin. But in American South, there were different types of slaves. There was the field slave and the house slave.
And the term is, and again, anybody who's offended by this, I'm going to talk the way that I would talk normally. This is something that Brandon and I try and do because the idea is for us to have this true diversity and this inclusion is we should speak openly. So within the black circles that I've hung out with, even academically, we would say you have your field Negro and you have your house Negro. Mm-hmm. And that's the way it is.
But just as a reference point, please don't use this at home.
I mean, I use it in my house.
I know, but I'm just trying to protect people from getting their tail beat in the streets.
Oh, yeah.
Use this language.
Listen, consequences are up to you. You use at your own discretion.
I'm just trying to help you.
But people. So for me, that's a constraint because when I look at, we've talked about this growing up. So growing up in the family I grew up in, my sister and I are darker. My parents are much lighter. My parents are very similar complexion to my kids who have a white mom. Like that's the complexion of my kids. And so for me growing up, one of the things that my mom would say a lot to me growing up is that, you're too dark to get away with it, Kamarr. You're too dark to get away with it. Because the reality is there is this stratification. And so for me, if I were back in that day, I would most likely be a field Negro.
Wow.
Because of the color of my skin. Despite my intellect, despite my physical abilities and all that stuff, and the fact that I don't really have much physical abilities,
right.
I would be somebody who would be like, you're going to be out there picking cotton, you're going to be out there working in the fields because you're too dark for us to let you in the house near us. Meanwhile, the lighter skinned ones were the house Negroes, which is extra sad when you consider why they were lighter skinned.
Wow. Brandon, did you ever hear anything like that growing up? Like, you're too white to get away with that.
No.
You're too Casper-ish. You're going to get caught.
Well, I had to wear long sleeve shirts so I didn't get a sunburn.
So you were too white to get away with.
I was too white to get away with short sleeves in the summer.
That's almost similar.
Yeah.
Not at all.
No.
I don't think so.
No, probably not.
Well, that's health disparity. See, skin cancer. There you go. See?
So you got some bad stuff too. Yay.
Carrying my own burden.
Yes. But But part of my pushback about that, again, I know this is subconscious with me, is that because of that, because I am a more intellectually minded person, so I'm somebody who knows, back then I'd be forced outside most likely, despite the fact that I'm more of an inside kind of a guy. I love plants and natures, but I'm not a push the plow kind of a guy. I'm not built for that. I'm not made for that.
You would have been smart though. You would have been a great slave because you would have been like, you would have been like the peanut guy. You would have came up with 100 different ways.
I'm going to bow out of this.
No, that was a bad statement.
The smart field Negro was a dead field Negro.
But you think about it though. I mean, you're a genius. You got more degrees than a thermometer.
A smart field Negro is a dead field Negro. They're not supposed to be smart. If they're smart, you got to kill them.
That's true.
Like and this is something I do. True. This is something I think, like, these are the things that I carry that I realize, like, man, like I would not have survived.
That goes along with Frederick Douglass. He hated his intelligence because he longed for the ignorance of the other slaves.
Yeah.
Because it would have gotten him in trouble.
Yeah.
Isn't that an interesting thing that in America there was a time when intelligence was a bad thing?
Yeah. Wow. Well, you could argue it still is like that in some regards today. So with that in mind, with her, I have this view of her as and I wrote in my notes, a very delusional woman. And I think this is why I don't say she's necessarily not being Christian in the stuff she says. She's just got a really bad sense of reality. This is on page 54, December 21st, 1856. Sunday evening. Yesterday I was very unwell, having a bad cold and otherwise indisposed. Today is the calm, holy Sabbath. There is snow, the weather very cold. As we sat around our well-filled table, our children laughing and enjoying their dinner, a perfect picture of domestic happiness without a dark shadow. My thoughts for contrast turned to the dark prison in town with darker spirits, and I raised my heart in humble supplication that the wrath of the Almighty not descend upon his unworthy children. Now, we're going to talk more about this probably in the next episode, but she's talking about the idea that there's a possibility of a slave uprising. But we caught the villains. Yeah. And I'm sitting here in my nice warm home, and I'm so happy to know that Almighty God is going to keep us innocent people safe from those villainous fools who want to bring an end to slavery.
Because he is for us.
Yes.
And not against us.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, and you had alluded to this about this idea of how do you pastor?
Yeah.
Right. How do you pastor this viewpoint? And I had brought up the point for getting that quote right there. I had brought up the point, it's possible that in her mind there was a not possible. It's likely that in her mind there's a difference between the kind of child of God that she is as a white woman and the kind of child of God that this black slave would be.
Yeah.
And here she confirms it.
Yeah.
Right? These are his unworthy children.
Unworthy. So there's you guys can probably speak to this, theologically more intelligent than I can, but there's this theory that, God must hate those who are unfortunate in this world, and he has blessed those, kind of like a prosperity gospel.
Prosperity gospel, yeah.
He loves those that he has prospered, and he has cursed those who are lowly in this world. Does that seem a little bit of what she's taken here?
That's where it came from. Essentially, prosperity gospel today is just the inheritor of the slave theology that we had here in America.
Wow.
This idea, that's how they said, if you were equal to us when God made you, then you would not be able to be so easily enslaved by us. But this power dynamic is proof of our superiority in God's created image, so therefore we are supposed to exercise this.
So let me push the ball a little further. Would it be safe to argue that racism is a side effect of that prosperity gospel, so to speak?
Partly. I've read some people lately who talked about racism. I think,
or what, a supremacy. Maybe that's a better one.
Yeah. So a lot of people point to it and say it's greed more than anything else.
Gotcha.
They were so greedy to make money hand over fist, they were willing to be racist to do it. And after a couple of generations of that, the racism became so embedded that now their grandchildren are like, we are racist, and it gets us good stuff. But the ones who started the system, the beginning of chattel slavery and race-based slavery in America, which was a brand new invention, we invented that. Yay for us.
Yay.
Like before that, there was no race-based slavery. There was no, your kids inherited like that. It was just an economic system. And they said, we want even more. For the sake of greed, we're going to do a new kind of slavery. And it's going to be based off of race. And so they rewrote the idea of slavery to be racist for the sake of greed. That was the original idea. And then when it got along, it was no longer because of greed. It was, for honor, for integrity, for the sake of society, for culture, for all these other things. But the origination was greed.
Wow. So go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna clarify. So I think that something like the 1619 Project is trying to get at that. And I do think it's important, though, just for historical accuracy, to say that's not just America. That's not the United States of America, but that is the New World.
Yeah.
That's the European colonizing mindset that produces this, and the race that was taking place among the European nations to kind of latch hold and get their footholds in the New World. The greed that was driving that. That's what's driving this approach to slavery. Yeah. Which then, and this is something I think pastorally we all have to be mindful of, is the purpose of the gospel is not to baptize the ideas in vogue in the country we live in.
Right. Yeah.
The purpose of the gospel is to be a kingdom that looks nothing like the kingdoms of this world.
Right.
And so the goal is not to say America's the worst nation ever, nor is the goal to say that it is the second coming in itself. The goal is simply to say, because I am allied to Christ, because I have allegiance to Christ above any other allegiance I would hold,
right,
I'm going to speak to my country.
Yeah.
But I'm also going to speak to this system based on this idea of but what's the fruit of that? Where did it come from? It came from, I think, the greed.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think
greed that's not an American greed, it's
it's a human greed.
It's a human
greed.
It
is. Yeah. I think as a human condition, fallen status of a human condition. I think we would all agree that what you said is true. But now I'm wondering, what was the state of the church that Miss Ellen went to? Mm-hmm. I know it's hard to, we can't really say this.
Do they say which one? Because I know it's a known fact. I just don't know if it's stated in here.
I can't remember. But
I don't recall coming across it in here.
Imagine that this is the average church member.
Yeah.
Right.
She might have even been one of the more loving, less hardcore ones. She could be the example of a moderate.
Well, she could have been, she was affluent. Right. She was, obviously almost everything that she writes has some recognition of her relationship with the Lord in it.
Yeah.
So let's assume that she's reading her Bible and that she goes to church. That would be an average thing to guess, I imagine. Are the things that she's going to church reinforcing this, or are they confronting this mentality that she has, I wonder?
I think it's probably reinforcing it, because again, the continual temptation for us as pastors is to baptize our culture and to say this is good because it's ours.
Yeah.
Instead of saying this is what God says and confronting that.
Yeah.
Right.
And there's stuff for us, that the scripture confronts that we just don't see because we're in it.
Yeah.
Kamarr, you and I have talked about David Foster Wallace's This is Water.
Yeah.
That whole mindset of it's so hard to see what you're swimming in every day. It's so hard to see the air you breathe.
Yeah.
And if you can't see it, that's a problem in and of itself. But you know what I'm saying? But when it comes to these issues, our temptation as pastors is going to be defending our culture rather than pointing to the gospel, pointing to Jesus and saying, how does Jesus confront my culture and challenge my assumptions?
Wow. Now that there could be a whole show just on how do pastors even get to that point.
Well, that's what we're doing. So back again to how it is we started hanging out like we do is because, Richard, that was like the thing that you're saying. Like, one of the ways to do that is we have to have continual, intentional, engaged interaction with people who aren't like us.
Right.
And it needs to happen with us at a pastoral level so we can then try and lead that and teach that at a congregational level. Because that's something that there are voices out there, like something, again, Brandon, we've talked about this and I've been doing this more. I've been listening to and reading scholarship, theological scholarship that does not agree with me when it comes to LGBTQ issues. And I've been doing that because I say the only way I'm going to ever know if I'm wrong is if I listen to them and let them tell me why I'm wrong. That doesn't mean I have to agree with them saying I'm wrong.
Right.
But Miss Wallace here, the guy she sent off to die, he said, "You're wrong, lady. Right. I need to stay here." She didn't listen to him. She heard him and didn't listen to him.
Right.
If she had sat there and said, "I'm going to listen to my slaves," history shows there was a path forward. There were slave owners who were indeed slave owners who had a different approach to it, where it was to a degree where, like, okay, yes, they still own these people. That is still messed up and wrong and bad. But then you get to find out that their entire relationship was almost one of, yeah, I technically own you because this is the world we live in, and that's the paper I sign. But in reality, as long as none of these other white folks are around, we're equals. Right. Now, when they show up, we gotta put on the show so we can all stay alive and keep eating. But when they leave, we know what really is going on here. Yeah. And that did happen. There were places like that. There were very, very few and far between, but they existed.
Right.
And I think that existed because those were people who said, "I'm going to listen to you." What? You mean you don't like getting whipped? What? Why not? I thought it got you to increase in your godliness. Like, what do you mean? You don't like when I take your kid away when they're 2 years old so you can go work harder? What?
Yeah.
Why not?
Exactly.
I thought your people didn't care about your children. Like, conversations, real listening conversations to people who don't agree with you.
Yeah. You know what's interesting is as pastors, it would have been, I'm thinking just from the average pastor in this community at this time that may have had a Miss Ellen or many Miss Ellens in it, it would have been counterproductive in a lot of different ways to go against the current, to be able to proclaim that slave is your brother.
Yeah.
The one that you're buying and selling and trading, that's not property.
Yeah.
Which that was a common thought. Mm-hmm. This is property. You own them and you own their progeny. You own their children, their children's children, and so forth forever. It wouldn't have been good church politics to go against the grain. Yeah. I mean, a pastor would have risked his livelihood. He could have been, fired, sent off, depends on their government and how it worked. But it was not something that was probably regularly done.
He would have risked his life.
To that point, so we talked about the Black Monster quote earlier. On page 50, the quote from her journal is she talks about this slave insurrection, that she's worried about. And she says, "These poor creatures have no doubt been instigated to such dreadful intentions by fiends in the shape of white men." Mm-hmm. So she viewed any white man who would advocate for freedom as a fiend, not as a white man.
That's right.
Yeah.
So like a John Brown kind of guy.
My favorite white guy from that time. I'm telling you, John Brown's awesome.
So
and he died. And his sons died.
Right. But if her pastor, this is to Richard's point.
Yeah.
If her pastor had stood up and said, these are your brothers, these are your sisters, she would have said, and you're a fiend.
And she probably would have gotten walked out.
Yeah.
If they didn't chase him off.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Or
Killed him.
Kill him.
That was because, like you said, and so there is that reality. And so when we talk about pastoring, even something that we've been talking around, how do we pastor in this community now in this? I think sometimes the impatience with people who are outside the church or even people in younger generations, there's this impatience that says, and I know I say stuff like this sometimes too, like just blow it all up, burn it all down. I mean, and I say these things.
Probably not the most pastoral.
And I say these things, but something I think you guys have both come to see with me experientially is how I actually live is one that I recognize that some things you're going to have to just find a way to pastor through and not, destroy. And so even in our community, there's this idea of incremental changes because sometimes you're like, you know what, we can treat them like equals amongst ourselves and begin to have those conversations. And in maybe 30 years, we can get them freed, or we can pick up guns and start a revolution. Right. And the sad thing about the Civil War is that it went that direction because the other stuff wasn't happening. And I do believe that's on us as pastors. And I say us because even though we're not pastoring back then, those are our brothers. Yeah. And so because of that, that's my family. We as pastors, our family failed. And because of that, this other thing had to happen. But I also say us because, again, talking about my family history, slave owners are in my blood. I am their descendant too. Mm-hmm. Their sin is also a sin of my ancestors. And so I think there's that other conflict and tension in it that is worth talking about and just acknowledging that it's not just, well, I didn't do that. No, but my ancestors did. Mm-hmm. And they're my family. And I need to own that.
Yeah. I mean, there's biblical precedent that we need to have lament.
What?
Hey,
I love that book.
I know you love that word. You love that book. But there's a real place in that. And I think we don't do justice to the past. And I think in order to get through the past, you got to go through the past. You've got to deal with it. You can't ignore it. You can't pull a sheet over it. You've got to look at it face for what it is, and it's got to be grieved. It's no different than if there was a marriage that dissolved. There's a grieving process and a time where you can't just pick up your pants and just keep trucking along. You've got to stop, reflect. How did we get ourselves here? How do we prevent ourselves from going here again? And what's unfortunate as a nation, I don't think we have adequately done that. And I think when we're looking at what happened here in Christian County, what happened in Hopkinsville, I know we haven't had that time of reflection, a time of lamenting. There were some, and we're going to get into this in the chapters to come. There were some super sad things. I mean, slavery in itself was sad. Civil War in itself was sad. But as a community, have we really taken a look at, you know what? Let's come together as a community. Let's mourn, let's grieve, and let's agree to not do this again and look at constructive ways to never, ever not only get to that point again, which hopefully I don't think we'll ever get to that point again, but how do we recover and how do we get restored from what's happened historically?
Yeah. I think next one we're going to deal some of those things and grieve some of those things. But before we leave, I want to, closing out, Brandon, Miss Wallace is in your office. Mm-hmm. You're her pastor. And she's saying, I want you to tell me true, Pastor. This slavery thing, they're talking about coming, the war is coming close. It looks like they're going to end. I want you to tell me, like, am I wrong? Like, if you had her, what would be your pastoral counsel to Miss Wallace if she were actually going to listen, not call you a fiend, but she would actually listen to you? What would you pastorally say to her?
Oh, I think you have to start with at the beginning, right? Mm-hmm. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You go back that far because to treat a fellow image bearer the way she treated Lewis, or to treat a fellow image bearer the way I might treat, an employee at a shop who's taken too long and I decide to yell at him. So I'm not saying this is just her problem. This is my problem too. But we have to go back to the beginning. We have to get set in our minds, this person bears the image of the God who created the heavens and the earth. But he didn't just create the heavens and the earth. He's also the God who sent his son to die for us. And I think that model of Christ, looking at the sin, looking at the brokenness, you talked about how every generation, there's this connection. It's impossible to say she's not a good Christian because of her views on slavery, because every generation has had that issue that the church has missed. God knew all that. Yeah. He saw it. Wasn't a blind spot to him. It wasn't air to him. He saw it, and he was still willing to send Jesus. And so, Miss Wallace, you have to understand they are as much in the image of God as you are. Not only that, the call of God is not to recognize that, it's to die for that. It's to put your life on the line, to put your comfort and your security off the table, and to put their dignity on the table. And so whatever it costs socially, whatever it costs within your church, whatever it costs politically, upholding the dignity of a fellow image bearer has to take precedent, because that's what God is pointing us to. He thought we were worth enough to send his son for, right? And now the son has sent us for these others. And that then takes it from a hypothetical, these people are, she said they're unworthy children, right? Okay, they're children of God, but they're somehow lower than me. And in her, if I was to challenge her and challenge my thinking in that, it would be to say, but they're not. Yeah. They're not. Yeah, they're unworthy, but we're unworthy. Yeah. Right? What's called for is this response, not just to understand they're children of God, but to understand what that means for my engagement with them. An engagement like Christ, a willingness to die. And frankly, that's, as we're talking about this, one of my fears, just being transparent here, one of my fears is we're dealing with stuff I don't know the answers to. Yeah. You know?
Yeah.
Like I am. Yeah. I'm the stuffing in the Oreo sandwich here, right?
Oreos taste so good.
You said that, not me, by the way, just so we're clear.
I did.
And yet I don't know the answer. I don't know how to necessarily drive it all forward. And getting to that point of saying, well, we just should probably talk about it. Let's acknowledge this is not right. Yeah. We don't gain anything by ignoring it. Going back to the last chapter, we don't gain anything by ignoring it or pretending it didn't happen. We don't gain anything by saying it's not still affecting us. We've got to start with that conversation and say, even though I may not know the answer, let's start talking about it.
Yeah. That's right.
That's good. Well, hey, we are going to continue talking about chapter 2 in the next episode. But thank you, Brandon, for that. And we don't have answers. But we
have some answers. We just don't have all the answers.
We don't have all the answers. No, I mean,
Jesus is the answer.
Yeah.
Amen.
But again, great book. We are just trying to talk about how we pastor through hard times. Yeah. All right.